Hi Life Science students, this is your Mechanisms of Evolution quiz study guide. So like in that Paul Anderson video, we need to know those 5 mechanisms of evolution that he talked about remembering with your hand. So if you look at your hand and you start with your pinky, we can think of the first mechanism of evolution as being small, like our pinky, when there is a small population. We learned that that's often caused by genetic drift. When there's a small population, by chance, then that will cause a difference in the gene pool makeup, and that will lead to evolution. Then we used our ring finger to think about rings symbolizing a couple, so mating, and when mates are chosen, that will determine what genes are passed on to the next generation. And depending on what genes are passed down to the next generation, you could over time end up evolving based on mate choice. Then there is the middle finger, M middle finger, for mutation, and that is when there is a change in the gene sequence or gene code, and that change will alter the gene pool, and then that can lead to evolution. Then the pointer finger is, I guess I should switch it around here, is because it can move, it can point to different things, and that movement represents gene flow, which we also call migration, where there's movement from organisms of one population to organisms of another population, and that again will alter the gene pool of that population, which over time can cause evolution. And then the fifth finger or thumb is for selection. We were selected to have opposable thumbs so that we could manipulate tools. So that's why the thumb represents selection. So now let's go through these a little bit more in depth like we did in class, although we will move much quicker than we did in class. So that genetic drift, or that pinky, representing the small population. As you can see in this illustration down here, it happens by some chance event. So you start off with your population, whatever that may be, and then something, in this case somebody squashing or stepping on some of the bugs, changes the population. It reduces the size of the population. And then that leftover population will have a different genetic makeup than the original population. There'll be less genes to share when mating, and that means there's going to be less combinations of the genes to express traits, and over time that could lead to evolution. In the worm activity, the chance event that we talked about was the dice roll. So depending on what dice roll we had, the worms in our activity would pass on their genes to the next generation or not. Just a reminder, you will need to know for the quiz the 2 types of genetic drift that we learned about. We learned about the founder effect, where a small portion of a population will go someplace completely new and establish a new population. And that new population usually has a pretty drastically different genetic makeup than the original population. And then the bottleneck effect, I just really love this image here, is when again a small portion of the population is transferred someplace else, and then that surviving population has a very different genetic makeup than the original population. We had 2 examples. For our bottleneck example, we looked at elephant seals and how they were hunted down to near extinction. There was just about 20 left in the population, and with that few individuals in the population, they don't have that much choice of who to mate with, and therefore there's not a lot of variation in their genes, and so you get a very different genetic makeup of the population that is regrowing versus the population that existed years and years ago. And then the example of the founder effect that we looked at was when a small group of people in Pennsylvania, or group of people moved to Pennsylvania, an Amish settlement, and they isolated themselves in this little region and only mated or only had children amongst themselves. And there was this random disease that led to often having an extra digit. And so that's very prevalent in this Amish community because they didn't breed outside their community. So the mating, or that ring finger, you can really think of as like a deck of cards. If your gene pool is all the variation that exists in the cards, it's always there in the cards. So you can shuffle the cards, which is like mating different individuals within the population, and then you can lay them all out again. And they're still going to be the same cards, even though they're in a different order. So even though some of the genes may be distributed differently within the next generation, they're still the same kinds of genes. They're still the same kinds of cards. However, like Paul Anderson talked about in his video, there's often choice in mating. And so if for some reason, like in the video, only redheads mate together, or nobody ever mates with a redhead, then that could change the distribution of genes that are passed down to the next generation because of that mating choice that we have. The middle finger, M, is for mutation, and this is not like some sci-fi creepy cartoon Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle mutation. This is some phenomenon, we'll get into that later, within the genetic code, changes the sequence of genes by a couple different mechanisms. We will get there later, and that alters the gene makeup. So if you all of a sudden took a black 4 out of the deck and replaced it with a red 4, that would change the cards in your hand. You would not have the same set of 52 cards in your deck as you did when you started with an original deck. Movement, or that pointer finger, what we call gene flow or migration, is when simply that you have a transfer. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be equal. It could be some of this population just goes over here and reestablishes, and that changes the genetic makeup of at least the population that got new members, and it will also change the population that lost members, even if they didn't get a new member, because with these genes gone, even the genes within the pool will have to redistribute differently. So there might be traits within these beetles that aren't expressed at the moment, but because these two have left and there's not as many mating choices, the genes that aren't expressed might, in future generations, look different. And then selection. We talked about, well, it's kind of random, but anyway, for selection we talked about 3 things. We talked about natural selection, which is what happens naturally when organisms adapt to their environment, and then over time the individuals within an environment that are best suited for that environment have a better chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. So over time the gene pool will change. And then we talked about artificial selection, like in the dog breeding, where we choose 2 different breeds of dogs to mate so that their offspring will have certain traits. And we've also talked about how that could be done with vegetables. Mix the pollen of 2 different flowers to highlight a certain trait like a color. And then sexual selection, which we talked about, an example of that being the peacock feathers. They really don't serve a great function other than to attract a mate, which, since mating is the name of the game, you have to mate to pass on your genes, it is still very important. So sorry this has gone a little bit long. Good luck on your quiz, and call me if you have any questions.